다음 순서는 그랜트 뉴샴을 부르겠습니다.
Next, I would like to
워싱턴
invite
DC에 있는
Mr. Grant
안보정책센터의
Newsham.
선임 연구원이고요. 아시아 태평양 지역의 안보와 정치, 경제 문제에
Senior advisor
관심을
to
갖고
the system, and also he has been experienced in economics. He is also a
해병대 시절
colonel
태평양
in the
해병대
Marine Corps
정보부장을
and also
역임했고
the senior
두
research
차례에
fellow
걸쳐서
at the Center for
주일 미
Security
대사관의
Policy.
해병
He lived in
무관을
Tokyo for
역임했습니다.
20 years, and
일본
also
할 수 있죠.
he
국제무역,
had the executive roles in many
국제공법과
companies.
형법 분야의
And also he
전문
is an
변호사고요.
attorney with experience of
아시아
international
타임스의
trade,
주요
public
시사
international law,
해설자로도
and criminal
명성이
law.
높은
And also in the
언론인입니다.
Asia Times, he has contributed a lot. Now, the floor is yours.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. And what I'm just going to do is to offer some comments and observations about the importance of free elections, and also some things that I've noticed the more I've looked into the April 2020 Korean election. Now, actually, my experience with election fraud and rigged elections goes back to when I was 3 years old, actually. I can remember my mother telling me that Mr. Nixon lost the election because dead people voted in Chicago. I didn't know what it meant, of course, but eventually I did, and you do tend to associate Chicago with that sort of thing. So that's just an aside. But looking at the idea of elections, these are just absolutely, they're the key to consensual government, to a decently run society. It allows for the transfer of power between one group and another, and it gives the average citizen some idea that his interests are represented, and that he has some say in how his country is run. You do, of course, need other things. You need to have a sort of a decent society. You need an honest judiciary. You need a free, aggressive press. You need intelligence services and the military that are apolitical. You need a clean bureaucracy, and you need honest, diligent legislators. But looking at elections, and that's what I'm here for, is the elections are incredibly fragile. Now, they sound simple, and they kind of are, but they're very hard to keep alive, to keep them honest. And because there's always a certain type of person, a certain type of politician who doesn't want that, who wants to subvert the election, really so that it's all about power, and also to avoid accountability for wrongdoing. Right? And there's no shortage of examples. Today in Belarus, in White Russia, you have just a completely rigged election, and just go down the list, and there's no shortage of examples. But you have this problem, of course, and everyone can understand this, that one-party rule, where one party, one group has permanent power, it invariably leads to the same problems. Society, government becomes corrupt, the opposition is weakened, it effectively neutered, it loses any sort of a power. The press is no longer a free press. You have the judiciary inevitably becomes corrupt and does the ruling group's bidding. The economy, it ruins the economy eventually, but it certainly will. And then you find that these kind of regimes that they will not give up power, they tend to only associate with similar regimes. So you have the North Koreas, the Irans, the Russias, the Chinas of the world. They all like each other, but the free civilized countries, they don't have anything to do with them or with each other. But I'm going to focus on one thing about elections that I think are particularly important, and that is that you can't, because one thing is election rigging, or when you fake an election, that can often be hard to detect, because most governments try to keep it secret. Some don't even bother. Once again, Venezuela, Belarus, they don't care. But usually, particularly in a civilized country that you're trying to subvert, it's hard to actually find the smoking gun, to find the direct evidence, but there is one way that you can draw some reasonable inferences, and that is how a government responds to claims of election rigging, a fraudulent election. That actually tells you a lot. And it tells you two main things. It gives you some idea about the nature of the administration, about the nature of the government, and also it tells you something about the likelihood that there actually was fraud as alleged. And so what's the response? What are the telltale signs? If the administration or the regime, if they just dismiss the claims, they say it didn't happen, or they ignore the allegations, or if they just make the most cursory, superficial response to it that nobody could possibly believe, that tells you something. And if they intimidate people who raise these charges, particularly using the so-called legal process to silence the critics, to silence the people who've accused them of wrongdoing, that tells you everything. So what do you have? If a regime does this, you know that what they want is one-party rule. Sometimes it's obvious, but in order to subvert a country, it usually takes time. Venezuela is an excellent example of that, because that took a little while for the bad guys to get their hands around the throat of the Venezuelan society. It took some time, but it tells you what the regime wants, and the objective is one-party dictatorship. But the second point is that it also tells you that, yeah, the election probably was rigged. And just what we know of human nature tells us this. If that's the response to serious allegations, credible allegations against the most important part of a consensual democracy, and somebody doesn't want to deal with it, want to talk about it, but just dismisses it, or tries to suppress the people who bring that, well, the common sense tells us what exactly did happen, and probably that the charges are true. Now, I would just want to talk about the Korean election back in April, because I had followed the election in Korea, and I remember when the results came out, I remember thinking, wow, that was unusual. And I didn't really pay much attention to what had happened, because I don't generally think in a country like this that you're going to have election rigging. But the more I looked into it and the more I've learned, and since I've been able to come here and talk to people, the more interesting it gets. You go down the list of evidence, information, and you've got 25 candidates who filed suit. You've got upwards of maybe a total 140-ish of serious charges brought against of wrongdoing. This ranges from electronic manipulation, ballot counting machines, servers, use of QR codes. Then there's the statistical oddities of the voting patterns, particularly where it's early voting versus election day voting. In fact, the extent to which early votes just trickled in or came in just enough to tip the scales for Democratic Party candidates in an incredible number of closely contested cases, almost 100%. And one very credible observer actually compared some of the statistical improbabilities in the election results as flipping a coin 1,000 times and having it come up heads every time. Well, I would like to go to Las Vegas with whoever could pull that off. So then you have evidence of the actual the paper ballots being mishandled, fraud involved there. The so-called chain of custody for the physical ballots is so much anecdotal evidence that the chain of custody is terrible. You have things like surveillance cameras shut off in polling booths, polling stations, only for the early voting period. You have places where there's more votes than there are voters. And then you have some very serious misuse of personal protection, of personal information protection laws. And that in its own right should have alarms going off, and it's extremely serious. But also consider the context in which the election took place. That is important. And you have an administration which, by any measure, this was even, I could see it even long before the election, that was apparently intent on weakening or even ending the Republic of Korea U.S. relationship, with a preference for, apparently even a preference over, so that relationship, a preference for North Korea, a preference for China even. Now the Chinese would agree with the idea of weakening the relationship, getting the Americans off the Korean peninsula. And then you have these certainly curious events, like very senior ruling party officials and advisors who go to China and sign policy coordination agreements with Chinese entities. Once again, that is the context in which this takes place, and it goes to questions of certainly motivation. But here's what the thing. I would say just fairly new in looking into this, but when you consider the response of the administration and the relevant governmental entities in Korea, the response to these allegations. Now, the administration, of course, administrations never take these claims seriously, and they will just ignore it. So that's almost predictable. But you look at the NEC, the National Election Commission, their response has not been diligent. There's doubts about how they have handled, how well they're safely, securely they've handled equipment, ballots, and records to preserve it for future study. In terms of releasing information, they don't seem to have been very good. Having forensic examinations of the ballot counting machines. Once again, there's no proactive, aggressive way to disprove, for them to go out and say, look, we hear these charges, but here's why they're not true. They're just not doing that. And that is suspicious. The courts, once again, they do not seem to be all that interested in finding out what happened. That too is very suspicious behavior. Unfortunately, the media, the mass media here, does not seem to take much interest in this, and also apparently the opposition party doesn't seem as incensed or interested in as one might be. So, what are the inferences here? If you were to ask sort of any normal person on the street, if you described all of this, say it happened in America, an American city. If you asked a taxi driver or anybody, 100% of them would say, well, yeah, they're hiding something. What's so hard to figure out about that? And to me, that is a plausible, logical conclusion. And so what I would note is that what this group and people out here are doing is so important because nobody else seems to be digging into this with the enthusiasm that they should. And that's important. And I would also note that this is not just a South Korean issue. This is something that absolutely applies. It is important for America, for democracies in Asia and around the world. Just from an American perspective, what happens on this peninsula, it has a ripple effect for the security situation, the political situation in the region and beyond that we have relied on for decades now. Additionally, there's not enough democratic consensual governments around the world, and many of them are under siege, and you can't afford to lose one more. And America has its own election coming up, and we should certainly pay attention to what has happened here in South Korea. So it is important to figure out what happened or what didn't happen. And as I noted, the response of the incumbent administration in Korea and the relevant government entities, their response is going to tell you so much about what did or didn't happen here. So that is important. But once again, I appreciate the opportunity to actually come here and learn something about it, because it is so important to get this resolved and to really protect democracy, protect consensual government, and protect free people. So thank you very much.